Series of public talks. My name is Jenny Sinclair. I'm the founder and director of Together for the Common Good, a UK charity dedicated to civic and spiritual renewal. So we help Christians of all traditions read the signs of the times and fulfill their unique vocation for the common good. We work with leaders, churches, schools and charities. We hold talks like this from time to time. We publish online resources and we host the Leaving Egypt podcast and the Common Good Schools programme. Now, all our work is underpinned by the tradition of Catholic social teaching. Rooted in Scripture, it's a non-partisan, deep theological framework intended for everyone of goodwill, not just for Catholics. And first, let me say how delighted I am to have Matthew Sanders as our speaker this evening, and I'll introduce him in a few moments. I'd like to thank our sponsors and partners who've made tonight possible: the Guild of Our Lady of Ransom, the evangelisation charity, the Catholic Union, and CCLA, the leading investment manager for mission-driven organisations in the UK. CCLA has an investment fund aligned with Catholic social teaching, and it runs the Better World Fund for individual investors and helps Christian investors across all traditions, churches and charities align their investment policies with their beliefs and values. So let me introduce this evening. In this Staying Human series, we're exploring how Christian theology can resource us in this moment of profound change to uphold what it means to be human. The stakes are high, and it's time to speak honestly, listen courageously, and act constructively. I'm still inspired by our friend, the late Frank Field, who had the courage to face the truth and talk about the difficult things. We need that spirit to face the realities of our time. The UK is in the midst of a deep crisis. Trust in the state is collapsing, people are angry, and the country is fragmented. The underlying philosophy of our collapsing era, based on a false anthropology, has failed in economic, social, moral, and spiritual terms. While we recognise the realities before us, we at Together for the Common Good sense that God is drawing us into a story of renewal and a deeper appreciation of what it means to be human. And our work aims to help people across the churches respond to the new era. I began this series by asking Luke Bretherton to help us think about human agency and the spirit of the commons. I then asked Maurice Glassman and John Cruddas to address how statecraft and political economy need to change. Then Susanna Black-Roberts to explore what it means to be a person in the age of AI. And then Dan Hitchens to address the value of human life in the context of the push for assisted suicide. This Staying Human theme is really about recognising who we are and how we can resist dehumanising forces. So now tonight we turn to the impact of AI on work and human purpose. Now, many people still think of AI as some kind of specialist tech area that they can safely leave to others. They haven't recognised we are on the brink of a new industrial revolution. And the role of churches will be critical here. In this volatile new era, a gospel-rooted vision is vital if we are to uphold human agency, mitigate the potential for social unrest, and if human conscience, vocation and mutuality are to be upheld. And so I'm honoured and delighted to welcome Matthew Sanders, who's going to help us get to grips with this hard new reality. Matthew is founder and CEO of Longbeard, the leading mission-driven technology company building faithful, Catholic-oriented artificial intelligence. Matthew and his team have developed some of the most significant Catholic AI initiatives in the world, including Magisterium AI, a powerful large language model trained exclusively on official church documents and ancient Christian manuscripts. Also, they've developed Vulgate AI, a dedicated tool for biblical access and study, and Ephraim, the world's first fully dedicated Catholic AI. Matthew is deeply committed to creating technology that fosters human solidarity, serves the church, and challenges the dominant technocratic paradigms of our age. He's also the founder of the Builders AI Forum and has served as a digital strategist for numerous Catholic non-profits, creating ethical tech platforms for evangelization and environmental education. So without further ado, let me welcome Matthew.
Well, good evening. Thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure coming back to England. You still have, I think, the most beautiful city in the world. So at the great turning points of this civilization, questions about work, about what it does to human beings. Let me just turn off my speaker here quick. There we go. Questions about work, about what it does to human beings and what human beings owe one another through it, have found their way to rooms like this one. Not usually before the disruption has arrived, but inside it, when the cost has become impossible to look away from. I think we are at that point now, and I find myself grateful for that and for the invitation to think through it with you. I want to note the date. We are 5 days past the 135th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, which is Leo XIII's letter of the 15th of May, 1891. That encyclical gave us the modern church, her language for work, her framework for thinking about what labor does to human beings, and what human beings owe one another through it. It is the right moment, I think, to be asking these questions again. There's also a river about a mile east of here that has its own quiet connection to the anniversary we're marking. I'll come back to that before the evening is out. I should say at the outset that I run a company, as Jenny mentioned, that puts artificial intelligence into the hands of users every day. And I see it at quite close range, what these systems can and cannot do, and what they're about to be able to do. And I don't say that to claim authority. I haven't earned in front of a room with rather more theological and pastoral experience than I have. But I do think it means some of what I'm about to say will be harder to dismiss as alarmism. And I suspect some of it will be rather harder to hear. Here then is the question I'd like us to sit with for the next 40-odd minutes. We're about to find out whether the things that make human work worth doing, and just as importantly, the things that work has been doing to human beings for as long as there have been human beings, if we can survive what is coming. I'm not sure the world has asked that question carefully enough, and tonight, with your help, I want to try. I want to move from the evidence, what is actually happening, and on what timeline, to the theological instrument I think is the right one for diagnosing it. From there, to what it means for this country, which is rather more exposed than the headlines suggest. And from there to what I think is being asked of the traditions gathered here, a framework for discernment, a vision of what might come after, and 3 specific charges for this room. Let me begin with where we actually are, because I think the honest answer is that most of the public conversation is still describing a future that has in fact already arrived. The Stanford AI Index for 2026 reports that generative AI reached 53% population adoption in 3 years. The smartphone took 6 years to reach that threshold. This took 3. Nothing has ever moved faster. 88% of organizations are now using AI in some form. 4 in 5 students from high school to university now use generative AI for their schoolwork. The question is no longer whether this has arrived. It has. The question is what is becoming. On capability, agent task success, the ability of these systems to carry out multi-step work autonomously, rose from 12% to 66% in a single year on key benchmarks, according to Stanford's AI Index. The UK government's own assessment of AI capabilities published last year, found that frontier models now produced what evaluators judge to be expert quality work on nearly half of real-world professional tasks, and that the complexity of tasks these systems can perform autonomously has roughly doubled every 7 months. I'd ask you to hold that doubling figure in mind. It's the rate, more than any single capability, that should concentrate the attention. The productivity numbers are equally striking. Gains of 14 to 26% in customer support and software development, which is large by historical standards. But there is one finding in the Stanford data that I want to park for a moment and come back to later, because it turns out to matter more than anything else on the page. The report notes that productivity gains are, and I quote, weaker or negative in tasks requiring more judgment, end quote. Hold that finding lightly in the back of your mind. It will return. Now, there's a gap I find it impossible to read without some pastoral concern. 73% of AI experts expect a positive job impact from this technology. 23% of the public do. That is a 50-point chasm between the people building the systems and the people who live inside the world those systems make. And I'd suggest, at the risk of being too direct, that a 50-point gap of that kind is a political and pastoral emergency waiting to happen. The question isn't whether the gap closes, it's how and how violently, and who is there when it does. One quick theological proviso, because I know this room will want it. I'm not making any claim tonight about machine consciousness or moral agency or interiority. I think those questions are real, and the answer is clearer than some of the marketing suggests, but none of tonight depends on it. Economic disruption only requires capability, and the capability is here. Let me turn now to what I think the timeline actually looks like, with the caveat that I hold these projections loosely, as anyone honest about this technology should. The builders themselves disagree, sometimes sharply, and I want you to weigh the testimony rather than take any single voice as gospel. But I think it's useful to think of the disruption arriving in 3 waves. Before I describe those waves, I want to name one thing clearly, because it is easy to miss in the current conversation. What we are discussing tonight is not only a software phenomenon. The same intelligence that is replacing the analyst and the junior lawyer is, as it becomes embodied in physical systems, in the humanoid robots now being deployed in warehouses, on factory floors by companies like Figure and Tesla, beginning to move into manual and physical work as well. The timeline is different because software deploys faster because there are no physical constraints, but the direction is the same. There is no sector, ultimately, that the combination of software AI and embodied AI leaves untouched. White-collar work is simply the first. Now, the first horizon is roughly the next 2 years, by 2028. This is the entry-level white-collar wave, and it is already happening. In the United States, employment among software developers aged 22 to 25 fell by nearly 20% between 2024 and last year. In the UK, job adverts for high-exposure occupations dropped 38% between 2022 and 2025. 1/3 of organizations surveyed expect to reduce their workforce in the coming year. Mustafa Suleyman, who is the CEO of Microsoft AI, and is, I point out, a builder, not a critic, said earlier this year that most white-collar work, in his words, will be fully automated by an AI within the next 12 to 18 months, end quote. Dario Amodei, the chief executive of Anthropic, told Axios in May 2025 that AI could wipe out, in his words, half of all entry-level white-collar jobs within 5 years, end quote. These are not external critics warning about a hypothetical. These are the people shipping the product, describing the consequences of what they themselves are shipping. The second horizon is roughly 5 years out, but I want to pause here because 5 years out now means arriving in the same window as what may be the most consequential event in the entire story, AGI, Artificial General Intelligence, which is a system capable of most cognitive tasks that human beings can do. Demis Hassabis, the CEO of Google DeepMind, who's based here in London, said at Davos in January this year that he assigns a 50% probability to AGI arriving by 2030. Sam Altman, CEO of OpenAI, in February said, "We may be only a couple of years from early versions of true superintelligence." If that is roughly right, and I hold it loosely, as I think anyone honest with this technology should, then the picture changes fundamentally. We would not be living, by the middle of this decade, in a world of AI augmentation. We'd be living in the first years after a threshold that no previous economic disruption has reached. Think carefully about what AGI arriving by 2030 means for the employment picture. Even now, before AGI, practitioners already describe a consistent pattern. One person, equipped with current AI tools, doing the work of 5. Within a year of AGI arriving, in an economy that will, by then, have spent a decade deploying and integrating AI systems throughout every sector, the more honest figure may be one person doing the work of 100 or 200. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not certain of the number, and neither is anyone else, but I am fairly certain of the direction. And I would suggest that a society that has not begun to reckon with that possibility now in pastoral care, in formation, and in civic imagination will find itself reckoning with it in conditions of considerably greater urgency. Now think about what that means for work, not just white-collar work, mid-career professionals, analysts, writers, lawyers, accountants. Blue-collar work too, logistics, manufacturing, construction, and maintenance, as AI moves from software into embodied systems. Humanoid robots are no longer a laboratory curiosity. They are on factory floors now, doing the repetitive physical tasks that have employed working-class people in this country for 2 centuries. The pace of deployment in that domain is behind software AI, but the trajectory is the same, as I mentioned before. The pattern being described today, one person equipped with AI tools doing the work of 5, will look modest by comparison. Dylan Patel, the founder of SemiAnalysis and one of the most rigorous infrastructure analysts in the field, offered perhaps the most clinically honest version of this employment logic in a podcast interview this past April. Quote, "If this person can do the work of 5 to 10 to 15 people using these tools," he said, "then all of a sudden I should probably cut people." I find that phrase worth sitting with for a moment, not because it is callous, but because it names the structural logic with a kind of dispassionate clarity that more optimistic visions of augmentation tend to set aside. Vinod Khosla, the Silicon Valley venture capitalist and co-founder of Sun Microsystems, expects AI to handle 80% of economically valuable work within 5 years. Sam Altman put it more starkly, quote, "By the end of 2028, more of the world's intellectual capacity could reside inside of data centers than outside of them," end quote. And then almost as a throwaway, quote, "It'll be very hard to outwork a GPU," end quote. Andrew Bailey, the governor of the Bank of England, and I note this is not a man given to rhetorical excess, has said publicly that AI-driven job displacement could rival the Industrial Revolution. Now, I'd suggest gently that even that comparison may be too modest. Demis Hassabis, the CEO of Google DeepMind, told The Guardian last August that AI will be 10 times bigger than the Industrial Revolution and perhaps 10 times faster, unfolding over a decade rather than a century. If that is right, then Bailey's benchmark is not alarmist, it is conservative. The comparison to the Industrial Revolution is apt, but it may be simply on the wrong end of the scale. The third horizon is roughly 10 years out, by 2036, and here it asks for your patience because we're moving into territory the builders themselves describe as genuinely uncertain. This is the post-work horizon. Modi again said on CNBC at the end of January this year that AI is not replacing a single job, but is becoming, in his phrase, quote, "a general labor substitute for humans," end quote. A general labor substitute. Let that phrase sit with you for a moment. And then there's Elon Musk, and you can take Mr. Musk however you take him, but he said this in November 2023 on a stage in London alongside the then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. He said, quote, "There will come a point where no job is needed. You can have a job if you want to have a job for personal satisfaction, but the AI will be able to do everything," end quote. I want to balance that with the most thoughtful voice in the field, which I think is Demis Hassabis. In an interview with Time magazine earlier this year, He was asked what happens after AGI arrives. His answer is worth hearing in full. Quote, "Then I think it's a question of, can we distribute the productivity gains fairly and widely around the world? And then there's still a question after that of meaning and purpose. So that's the next philosophical question, which I actually think we need some great new philosophers to be thinking about today." End quote. I find that remarkable. The man building the most powerful AI system on earth is calling for philosophers. He has the engineering, he does not have the anthropology. Before I move on, a word on why this will not slow down. The United States cannot pause, because a pause advantages China. And China cannot pause either. With an aging population and a manufacturing economy under growing pressure, it needs AI and robotics more urgently than almost any other major power. Both sides understand that the first to reach AGI will very likely be the first to reach ASI, artificial superintelligence, which is a system that exceeds human cognition capacity in every conceivable domain. The country that crosses that threshold will hold enormous economic and military advantages that are difficult to overstate. That is why slowing down, whether for job market stability or AI safety, is a concession neither side believes it can make unilaterally. The consequence for every other nation follows from this. Those without sovereign AI capacity will find themselves dependent on Washington or Beijing for infrastructure that underpins their economies, their energy, and their defense. The race is structural, and it will not wait, which means the church cannot wait for policy to catch up. The disruption will not pause at the door of the parish. So those three horizons, 2 years, 5 years, and 10 years, raise a question that the language of productivity and labor economics, for all its real usefulness, can't quite reach. The builders can see with remarkable clarity what is ending. What they don't have, what I think the Christian tradition does have and has had for some time, is a category for what is actually being lost. And as it happens, I think a 45-year-old papal text gives us exactly the right one. But I want to pause here. Before the data gives way to theology and name what I think is actually happening, the disruption I've described is not primarily an economic event. It is an anthropological one. It is a question about what human beings are for when the economic rationale for their labor has been removed or diminished. That is not a question productivity economics was built to answer. It is a question that Catholic social thought has been working on for a very long time. Now, I want to turn to John Paul II's encyclical Rerum Novarum, published in 1981. And I want to introduce it not in the spirit of, and now for the religious portion of the evening, but in a rather different spirit. This is a text that turns out, to my surprise as many others, to be a remarkably precise instrument of diagnosis for exactly the moment we're in. The core move John Paul makes in section 6 of that letter is to distinguish two dimensions of human work. There is first what he calls the objective dimension, what is produced, the brief that gets written, the contract that gets drafted, the diagnosis that gets reached, the code that gets shipped, the bridge that gets built. The objective dimension is what economists measure. It's real and important, and I don't want to be heard as minimizing it. But there is, second, what he calls the subjective dimension. What happens in the worker through doing of the work. Character formed, judgment trained over years of getting it slightly wrong and learning from the wrongness. Vocation discerned, conscience sharpened across real cases. Relationships built between colleagues, between mentor and apprentice, between professional and the person served. The image of God shaped slowly through the discipline of making something and being responsible for it. The subjective dimension is what work does to the worker. And John Paul's claim, the one I want us to take seriously tonight, is that the subjective dimension is, in his words, the more important of the two. The famous formulation in section 6 is this, quote, "Work is for man and not man for work," end quote. I suggest that question this raises for us is not whether machines can do our work. In many domains they already can, and they will increasingly. The real question is what we lose, what the worker loses when the scaffolding of that formation is removed. What happens to a generation that never has the apprenticeship, never gets the slightly humiliating moment being corrected by a senior at 4 in the afternoon, never builds the judgment that only comes from being responsible for an outcome you couldn't quite produce on your own? I note, too, that this isn't a conclusion I'm reaching on my own. In January last year, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith published a note called Encyclical Nova, addressing artificial intelligence directly. And when the Dicastery reached for an instrument with which to think about AI, the instrument it reached for was Rerum Novarum, Section 6. The note observes that, quote, AI performs tasks, end quote, but does not think, end quote. It draws the line clearly and explicitly that, quote, only humans are moral agents, end quote. This isn't prospective application. This is the doctrinal office of the Catholic Church saying the category we need for this moment was given to us 45 years ago. Pope Leo XIV, speaking to the Pontifical Academy for Life last November on AI in medicine, put the same point in pastoral language. He said, quote, medical professionalism can never be reduced merely to solving a problem, end quote. Think about what he's doing there. The objective dimension of the doctor's work, which is reaching the right diagnosis, is something an AI system can already do, in many cases as well or better than the average clinician. But the doctor's work, Leo is saying, is not the diagnosis. It is the relationship with the suffering person. An AI can produce the diagnosis. It cannot be the doctor. And now I want to return to a finding I mentioned earlier that I asked you to hold in mind. The Stanford report observed that AI productivity gains are weaker or negative in tasks requiring more judgment. And I'd suggest, very gently, that this is not a coincidence. The market is discovering by trial and error and quarterly earnings calls the same boundary that the theology identified 4.5 decades ago. The machine runs up against the subjective dimension and slows. The economists don't yet have a name for what the wall is made of, but we do. I'll close this section with Newman, who put the same intuition in his own register, in the idea of a university, Discourse 8. He wrote, quote, the world is content with setting right the surface of things. The church aims at regenerating the very depths of the heart, end quote. I think that's almost exactly right for the moment we're in. AI is going to set right the surface of an enormous amount. The church tends the depth. The two are not in competition, but only one of them is irreplaceable. If that distinction holds, if the objective and subjective dimensions really are distinct, and if it really is the subjective dimension that the machine cannot reach, then it gives us something rather useful, a working instrument of discernment. And I want to suggest, tentatively, 4 marks of what must remain human, each grounded not only in theology, but in sources that I think this room will find credible on their own terms. The first mark is judgment under moral weight, decisions in which a human life or human dignity or a human future is at stake. The sentence handed down, the diagnosis delivered, the hire made or the redundancy issued, the decision to operate when the outcome is uncertain. Think of the partner at the law firm who must decide whether to take a case that will pay the bills but trouble her conscience. The AI can the precedence. It cannot carry the weight. Antiqua Nova is clear. Only humans are moral agents. And Leo XIV, in his message for the 16th World Day of Communications, published in January this year, put the risk plainly. Renouncing creativity and surrendering our mental capacities and imaginations to machines, he wrote, would mean burying the talents we have. And perhaps most strikingly, the economics agree. The Stanford finding, again, weaker or negative gains in tasks requiring judgment. 3 independent witnesses, the magisterium, the Pope, and the productivity data, pointing to the same boundary. I suggest we ought to take that convergence seriously. The second mark is presence with the suffering. This is Leo XIV's point about medicine, and it generalizes. The chaplain at the bedside, the nurse who notices that something is wrong before the monitors do, the social worker, the priest in the confessional, the teacher who stays after class because the child is hesitating at the door. These are not jobs in the GDP sense. They are, I'd suggest, a form of being with another person, a way of being present that is itself the substance of the work, not the wrapping around it. Presence can be imitated. It cannot be replicated. And I would gently suggest that the widespread deployment of AI in pastoral care, without this distinction being very clearly in view, would be a pastoral emergency, not a pastoral innovation. You'll know better than I where the pressure points in your own traditions are, but I suspect they are very close. The third mark is the formation of conscience and character. Catechesis, mentorship, spiritual direction, parenting, teaching the young to discern between the things that look alike but are not the same. Think of the young person learning slowly and through failure to tell the truth when the truth is costly. This is the work of building the subjective dimension in another person, of shaping a soul over years rather than delivering an output in seconds. This is, I suggest, the Church's home ground. It is also, I'd note with some sadness, precisely the ground that the economy of the last 2 generations has spent considerable energy teaching us to undervalue. The catechist and the contract lawyer have not been compensated according to the relative contribution to human flourishing. The fourth mark is the givenness of community, friendship, marriage, parish, neighborhood. The body of Christ in its irreducible local form. Relationships that are received rather than optimized. Think of the neighbor you did not choose, whose need arrives at your door unbidden, and whom you help anyway because you are formed in a tradition that tells you that is what neighbors are for. The market has no instrument for measuring these things. And that is not a criticism of markets. Markets are not designed to price friendship or parish or the loyalty of a neighborhood. But it does mean that when the market alone organizes social life, these goods tend to go unprotected and unreplaced. The Church, when she is being herself, holds them as gifts, as the medium, in fact, through which the human person finds grounding. I'd put the pastoral implications of these 4 marks like this, and I offer it knowing that you, not I, but I will work it out in practice. Every formation program, every seminary curriculum, every lay leadership pipeline in this country ought now to be asking itself a fairly direct question. Are you forming people for these 4 things? Or are you still, by inheritance and habit, training them for objective tasks that the machines will do better than they do next year, and better still the year after that? Because if it's the latter, the pipeline is, with respect, training people for a world that is already vanishing. Given this framework then, given what is generally at stake in those 4 marks, I want to try to make it specific. Not to the abstract global economy, which is rather too easy, I think, to gesture at, but to this country, to this city, to the congregations many of you lead. Because this isn't an American conversation being imported. Britain, I'd suggest, is structurally more exposed than the headlines have so far made clear. The Department for Science, Innovation and Technology's own assessment published last year found that 70% of UK workers are in occupations that AI could perform or substantively enhance, against a US average of 60%. Roughly a third of the UK workforce sit in what the assessment calls low complementary roles. Roles where AI doesn't augment the worker, it displaces them. And as I mentioned earlier, job adverts in high-exposure occupations dropped 38% between 2022 and last year. These are not projections. They are descriptions of what has already begun. So why is Britain more exposed? I suggest the answer is uncomfortably simple. Britain made a national bet over the last 40 years on services. Finance, law, consulting, professional services, administration, media, higher education. These are exactly the sectors that agentic AI processes first and most thoroughly. Germany makes things. Britain processes information. That comparative advantage has rather suddenly become a comparative vulnerability. And I'd also note, without wanting to make this too geographic, that London and the Southeast carry a disproportionate share of that vulnerability. The map of British prosperity over the last generation and the map of British exposure to AI displacement are, I'm afraid, very nearly the same map. I want to add one voice to that picture from outside Britain because it names what the numbers mean when filtered through someone who with no incentive to be alarmed. Ken Griffin, who's the founder of Citadel, manages approximately $65 billion and has, for much of the last 2 years, been among the more hard-nosed skeptics of artificial intelligence and global finance. At the World Economic Forum in January of this year, he called generative AI, in his own words, garbage. That was 4 months ago. Earlier this month at Stanford, he said something rather different. He described agentic AI systems inside Citadel completing work that would previously have required teams with master's degrees and PhDs in finance, work measured in weeks or months, in a matter of hours or days. He was quite precise about what he was describing. Quote, "These are not mid-tier white-collar jobs. These are extraordinarily highly skilled jobs being automated by agentic AI," end quote. And then he said he went home one Friday, quote, "fairly depressed," end quote. Because when you witness it in your own institution, when the data points stop being projections and become something happening in the room next door, the impact becomes difficult to look away from. I raise him not to end on that note. Griffin is a brilliant diagnostician of markets, and I suspect a rather more limited diagnostician of markets, of what a market exists to serve. But because a man of that temperament, describing that experience in a speech released a fortnight before this one, seems to me like exactly the kind of witness the conversation deserves. Now, connect that data to the 4 marks we've just walked through, and I think the question that emerges is deeper than it first appears. The roles being displaced fastest are not the manual trades. They are the junior professional ones, the trainee solicitor, the graduate analyst, the junior developer, the assistant editor, the first-year associate. These are apprenticeships through which judgment, presence, conscience, and community have historically been formed. Perhaps by 2035, with AGI reshaping the economy, even those senior roles will themselves be automated. Perhaps they will be. But I don't think that settles the question. It deepens it. Because what we are dismantling is not a career pipeline, it is a formation pipeline. The way human beings learn to sit with complexity. The way they develop the judgment to act when the answer is not clear. We are dismantling the conditions under which human judgment is formed at the very moment when human judgment is the one thing AI cannot supply. Andrew Bailey's comparison to the Industrial Revolution coming from the governor of the Bank of England and not from a pulpit is worth dwelling on for a moment. The Industrial Revolution did eventually produce extraordinary wealth. It also produced, along the way, the dock workers of 1889. It produced the conditions that Rerum Novarum was written into. And I think it is worth being honest about who the dock workers of 2035 are likely to be, and what kind of work they'll do or fail to find, and what kind of churches and chapels and communities will or won't be there to meet them. Now, the data tells us what is being lost. What it cannot tell us, what no productivity report, however careful, will ever tell us, is what waits on the other side. We spent some time now with the diagnosis. I want to give what time remains to the question of response. What I think is being asked of the traditions gathered here, and whether the church has something to offer that no productivity strategy can furnish. I find myself thinking she might, and I'd like to try to say why. The horizon we're approaching, and I think we are approaching it, though I hold the timing loosely, is one in which the link between human work and human survival, a link that is held for the entire span of recorded history, is severed. That's worth sitting with for a moment. For as long as there have been human beings, the question, how will you eat, has been answered for most people by some version of I will work. That equation is what economists, theologians, and politicians have been arguing about for 2 centuries. And it may be within the working lives of people sitting in this room that equation simply just dissolves. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not suggesting the end of human work. Human beings will go on making, tending, teaching, healing, creating, praying. It is, I think, constitutive of what we are. What I'm suggesting is the end of working primarily to survive. And that is a different civilization. Elon Musk, speaking at the Viva Technology Conference in Paris in May 2024, put it this way, quote, "In a benign scenario, probably none of us will have a job," end quote. He gave that roughly an 80% probability. Now, you can take that estimate seriously, or you can take it with a fistful of salt. I'd suggest somewhere in between is wise. But what I find more interesting is the question he asked next, because it's the right question. Quote, "The question will really be one of meaning," he said. "If a computer can do everything better than you, does your life have meaning?" End quote. That is, I would suggest, one of the more theologically serious sentences uttered by a technology executive in our lifetime. His answer, though, is where I think the argument runs short. His answer is universal high income and work reconceived, and I quote, "as sports or a video game, and everyone enjoying abundance." And I want to say as gently as I can that this is despair dressed as utopia. Work as a video game is not a vision of human flourishing. It is a vision of human sedation. It mistakes the absence of necessity for the presence of purpose, and those are not the same thing at all. Let me add a partial counter, because honesty requires it. As the machine economy grows vast and cheap, a parallel human economy may grow alongside it. Smaller, premium, valued because a person made it. The Etsy economy, if you like, beside the GDP economy. People will pay more for human craft, human teaching, human care. And this is genuine. But it does not scale to a civilization, and it does not answer the question of meaning. Viktor Frankl, whose reflections in A Man's Search for Meaning and the Will to Meaning address this directly, and who knew more about meaning under conditions of extremity than most of us ever will, observed that when human beings lose the structure and purpose that organize their days, they don't quietly flourish in their newfound leisure. They become disoriented. They become unwell. The crisis of the post-work era, it seems to me, will not be a crisis of poverty. It will be a crisis of meaning. And a society that has spent 2 centuries telling people that their worth is measured by their economic contribution will discover, rather suddenly, that it has no other vocabulary available when the economic contribution is no longer required. Now, this is where I want to bring in the universal basic income, because the conversation about UBI has become, in my view, both more urgent and more inadequate than its proponents recognize. UBI is necessary. I'll say that plainly. If the link between work and survival is severed, some mechanism of distribution has to replace it, and UBI, in some form, is probably the least bad of the available instruments. But it is necessary and insufficient. It addresses what John Paul II called the objective dimension of work, the wage, the output, the economic transaction. It does nothing whatsoever for the subjective dimension, the formation of the worker, the cultivation of judgment, the experience of being needed, the dignity of contribution. No government program has ever given a person a vocation, and I would suggest no government program ever will. Which is why Leo XIV's words at a conference on artificial intelligence last December land with such force in this context. He said, quote, "Human beings are called to be co-workers in the work of creation, not merely passive consumers of content generated by artificial intelligence," end quote. That is the diagnosis in a single sentence. UBI addresses survival. It does not address vocation. It cannot tell a person what they are for. So what does the church actually offer here? Not, I hope, a policy paper. Something more fundamental. Structure, community, vocation, shared purpose, formation in communion, and this matters, offered not from above, not as imposition, but at the level of the person and the parish. And here I want to say something about this country in particular, as far as I understand it. For most of England's history, it was organized around towns, villages, and parishes. The spire was the center of the settlement, geographically and otherwise. People knew their neighbors. Obligation was face-to-face. the pub, the school, the parish church, the market. These were not abstractions. They were the texture of life. Now, I'm not romanticizing the medieval village. There was poverty, there was cruelty, there was the closed mind of the small community. I'm not asking anyone to recreate it, but I would suggest that the human scale the parish represents is not, in the post-work era, an exercise in nostalgia. It may be the forward-looking answer. Because when survival no longer organizes the day, what does? And the honest answer is, nothing organizes the day unless something local, embodied, and shared organizes the day. Which brings us to subsidiarity, that lovely Catholic word for what is in fact a deeply ecumenical instinct. Others around you are too. I mentioned earlier that 73% of AI experts expect a broadly positive outcome from this technology, while only 23% of the public does. That 50-point gap is not a communications failure. I would suggest it is a democratic emergency. Patel gave a strikingly direct geography of this fracture on the Dwarkish podcast in March. Quote, in San Francisco, he said, we're just thinking on a timescale of weeks. And then if you're outside of San Francisco, you're not thinking about the AGI at all. The people designing this transition are thinking in weeks. The people who will live inside its consequences are, in the main, not thinking about it at all. And that asymmetry is not a matter of messaging, it's a structural one, and I think it raises a fundamentally political question. Pope Francis put it precisely in Laudatum Deum, quote, "In whose hands does all this power lie, or will it eventually end up? It is extremely risky for a small part of humanity to have it," end quote. The dockers of 1889 did not need a degree in shipping logistics to know whether a fair day's wage was being paid. The people affected by this transition do not need to be AI researchers to ask, who controls this, who benefits, and who bears the cost? The regulatory framework being written now will govern your children's working lives. An informed laity exercising civic judgment in the ballot box, in the town hall, in the public square, is not a secondary feature of Christian life. It is one of the Church's answers to the question of power. Act across confessional lines. Anglican, Catholic, Methodist, Reformed, Orthodox, Free Church. On this question, we already won body because the people losing their work do not sort themselves by communion. The labor movement of the 1880s was built across confessional lines in this city. What's coming will require nothing less. Those are the charges. Let me, in closing, try to say what I think this particular room, on this particular evening, why it matters. I mentioned at the start that there was a river a mile east of here with its own connection to the anniversary we're marking tonight. It's the Thames. And in the summer and autumn of 1889, along its docks, 150,000 men struck work in what was then the richest city the world had ever seen. They were asking for 6 pence an hour, the docker's tanner, and a minimum 4-hour engagement. Not a revolution, a wage you could feed a child on. Into that dispute walked Cardinal Henry Edward Manning, Archbishop of Westminster, 81 years old. He brought no economic plan. He had no leverage over the dock companies. He commanded no technology, no press operation, no political party. What he carried was moral authority and his willingness to be physically present where the suffering was. And he mediated the settlement on the 14th of September. Ben Tillett, who led the strike and who was not, I think it's fair to say, naturally disposed to defer to archbishops, said this afterwards, quote, "I could not withstand this gentle old man who touched so tenderly the heartstrings of his hearers with solemn talk about the suffering of wives and children. There was a final judgment and the cardinal won," end quote. And Manning himself had said, quote, "It is not a private affair. It is a public evil. The capitalist is invulnerable in his wealth. The working man without bread has no choice but either to agree or to hunger in his hungry home," end quote. 2 years later, 1891, Leo XIII published Rerum Novarum, and historians have asserted that Manning's intervention on the Thames helped move him to write it. Which means, and I want you to sit with this for a moment, the document, whose 135th anniversary brings us together tonight, was shaped in part by what happened a mile from this room. And I don't think that's coincidence, I think that's continuity. I've been informed that Lord Glassman, who spoke in this series, has described Manning in 3 words: stubborn, organized, and faithful. And I find myself returning to those words. Stubborn, not as obstinacy, but as a refusal to concede under the steady, polite pressure that says the suffering isn't really that bad, or isn't really your concern. Organized, because moral conviction without institutional form, it seems to me, tends to evaporate within a generation. Somebody has to build the thing that carries it forward. And faithful, because only fidelity, I think, gets you through the long temptation either to despair or to escape into the conforming fantasy that someone will sort this out. From Manning on the docks to Leo XIII in Rome, to Rerum Novarum, to this lecture tonight, to Parliament tomorrow afternoon, I don't think that line is accidental, and I don't think it's finished. It runs through every person sitting in this room. So I simply ask you, in whatever form your own life and vocation make possible, go where the suffering is. Be perhaps a little stubborn, a little organized, and God willing, faithful. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. It was absolutely brilliant and very powerful. So we're going to take a short break now for a couple of minutes while we rearrange the mics. And this is your opportunity to submit a question. I think we've got something coming up on the screen for the questions. And when we come back, we're going to be sitting in a slightly different arrangement. I'd suggest you have a chat with your neighbour. So I'll let you know when we're going to restart. Thank you. To go into the Q&A now. So thanks very much. We're going to go into the Q&A. So I'm going to take the opportunity of starting. I was really struck when you said we're particularly exposed in the UK. And it's really thanks to the change that we've undergone in the last 40 years. We've got an over-reliance on the knowledge economy, the service economies, a legacy of the globalization project, the offshoring of our manufacturing and so on. So we're exposed about what's yet to come. But I'm struck that given what you said about the link between human work and survival being severed, a link you said that was held for the entire span of recorded history, this has already happened in large parts of our country. Because our post-industrial towns and other places that lost their investment in manufacturing in the 80s and 90s, they've experienced this severing already. We already have a very large number of people living on benefits without work, sometimes for 5 generations. Our welfare system has meant that worklessness for them has become the norm. In effect, they have been discarded. I think you used the word rendered irrelevant. And our church-based charity has stepped up, but too often it acts as a kind of baked-in component of a welfare system which is characterised by a service provider dynamic, which exacerbates the us and them dynamic, the class divide. And we've seen the failure of successive governments to address this. We've seen no correction to that capital flight, no reinvestment. Instead, a politics of abandonment, actually, is my view, and further humiliation of those places. So as you say, people suffering that kind of loss are not quietly flourishing in their newfound leisure. They have become unwell, they have become disoriented, and despite, or perhaps because of, all that welfare and all that charity, that disorientation has, especially over the last 15 years or so, been increasingly manifesting in anger, and which I think is in part a yearning for meaning. So it seems to me that in the transition that you're setting out for us over the timeline you've described, unless we radically change the way we do charity and the way that we think about welfare, in fact reframing welfare completely, we will not only face a crisis of meaning and a crisis of poverty, but a crisis of solidarity. So my question is, to be ready for what's coming, what can both church and government learn from our current crisis of solidarity?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of these problems stem, and I'm not a political science professor or sociologist, but a lot of it has to do with transitioning from high trust to low trust society. And I think the church, in its various forms, used to perform a very important function, right? As I mentioned before, you kind of had the church in the middle of town, and it kind of brought everyone together, rich and poor.
Yeah.
And because for the most part, villages were fairly small in scope, because there was a sense of, I'm part of a community and I know everyone. If someone was down and out, everyone in the town knows that person. They know their story. It's not as easy to turn a blind eye. One of the interesting things with industrialization was this movement into cities, to build these massive cities, basically to serve capitalism, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. I mean, obviously the city has a lot of graces, but it is alienating, right? And so that the idea that I know my neighbors and things like that in a city context, when I grew up in Toronto, and I didn't, but they changed all the time, right? So everyone's kind of living as pretty much as individuals. Maybe there's a very small community, and they're working all the time. And all of a sudden life becomes oriented around the working part, about making sure I get enough so that I can survive. And that paradigm, I think, is overwhelming and helpful. So, I mean, to me, the reason why I decided to move into Catholic AI is, in large part, I think, is because we have to look like institutions like the Church, which have continuously been studying the human condition longer than anyone. I think they know the answer, and I've talked about it in the speech. I think we have to abstract away from these cities and start building more intentional communities where everyone can find a role and place for themselves, and people are known, and they feel a sense of community, and frankly, that there's a kind of a fabric of love which permeates the community. And I think without that, civilization is really at risk. I mean, the one thing that concerns me the most about this AI and robotics transition, maybe not the most, but it's certainly one of the things I'm concerned about. I mentioned in the speech that white-collar work's in jeopardy. Well, where do most of the white-collar workers dwell? They dwell in cities. This disruption of AI and robotics is going to come real fast. I talked about it's because of capitalism. It's because these big firms have to find new efficiencies in order to stay competitive, right? They have to make money. So when all of a sudden it becomes clear that an AI system can automate, 10, 20 of the PhD people I have working with me that are making big money, and all it costs is the price of electricity or the tokens if I'm using inference, I have no choice. I kind of have to pull the trigger on those people. And what I worry about is there could be a lot of people who are without jobs. Maybe they're not financially in dire straits because they've done well for themselves, but they're trapped in these condominiums. They don't know anybody. They have all this time on their hands, and so what do they constructively do with that time? And I worry that a lot of people, because they don't have that formation, will turn to distraction. And then they'll basically just eventually despair. And I worry about, if you play that out, how that's going to end. And so in many ways, I feel like addressing the looming crisis of the city is going to be absolutely critical for governments. We have to find a way for people to build solid communities.
Great. So we've got a lot of questions to get through. So let's crack on. This is from Jamie, who asks, How are you so certain about AI's future when much of it is subsidized by venture capital to the tune of $1 trillion with little profit to show for it?
I would say for the most part it's adoption. Anyone who uses AI, let's say like Claude Code, can see what a game changer it is. You know, Claude Code used to be something that solved software problems, and now they relaunched Claude Cowork, and now it's something that can do office work, and that's it's increasing. It seems like every day in capability, and so why do I feel confident that AI is going to play out this way? It's capitalism. I've seen how even in my own work, how these tools have allowed me to just be so much more productive. And I can see that eventually I just won't need to be prompting it as much. And it'll be running autonomously. And then I ask myself, well, what will I do, right? While it's running autonomously and generating all this economic value, what am I going to do? And as someone who has staff, and I feel that competitive pressures myself, this is going to pose hard questions. I'd like to think that people, for very pastoral reasons, will keep the employee gainfully employed. But as long as they're in a highly competitive market, they're going to be forced to make hard choices. And so because I'm seeing companies like Citadel and small startups adopting this technology and seeing how it's already starting to change workplace dynamics, I just feel very confident that capitalism will force a certain trajectory. And I don't think there's much we can really do about that without rethinking capitalism.
Okay. People have described AI as a tool and as a power. What formation needs to be provided to help not just the mighty, but all to use this challenging new power?
Well, I mean, the Pope is releasing his encyclical on AI on Monday. And I, for one, what I hope he focuses at least part of the encyclical on is, what is this whole civilization project supposed to be about? What is the point? If the point is human flourishing, what is human flourishing? Please spell that out for me. And what does human flourishing look like on an individual level? And what does it look like on a society level? I think if we can get clear about what human flourishing is, then we can start working backwards and saying, okay, well, it's about human flourishing. Are we developing these technologies? Are the right resources being directed to the right kinds of artificial intelligence to ensure that we're delivering flourishing and not necessarily profit? I think that's critically important. In this way, tools, we'll be developing the right tools, right? Whether some people are on a quest to build an artificial human being, whatever. I don't think that's a good idea, but I'm not going to stop people from doing that. But I think most of us, what we just want is, we want to flourish. And so I think a lot of the resources which are currently being directed to this, let's build an artificial human being project, which is called AGI because it's supposed to, unlock a lot of economic prosperity. I think some of those resources could be redirected if we got clear about what our civilizational priorities should be. And so we wouldn't have to take these flyers on a lot of these labs, which I'm sometimes have very complicated incentives for doing what they do.
Okay. Catherine asks, if people will pay more for human care and human attention, won't this lead to a huge inequality in dignity where the rich get human care and the poor a robot?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, I just think that's going to be a big problem. There are some places, like China, but not to pick on China, but China has an aging population and not enough people to service those people. So it's working out very well for them with AI and robotics, and they are a manufacturing powerhouse. So as robots increase in capability, and as they have these more and more powerful AI systems, these robots can therefore, because they're receiving this kind of general intelligence, they'll be able to kind of navigate and really do kind of any task. And that's good, because you have this aging population. Now you have a robot fleet that can look after them. So in some places, it's kind of a godsend. In others, it could be a disaster, specifically if people are choosing to spend their time and energy with robots or AIs instead of people, because robots and AIs are easier to deal with, right? They're not as messy. And I think it takes a lot of formation and a lot of discipline to understand the difference and to choose the messy as opposed to the clean and simple and easy.
Speaking of China, this next question is, China and the US are working together to discuss guardrails on AI. Are you surprised by this recent meeting and the friendliness?
Am I surprised that they said that they want to work on this? No. Will I be surprised if they come up with a unilateral agreement? Yes, I'll be very surprised, pleasantly surprised. I think that that's one of the big problems. Again, high trust, low trust applies to England, but it also applies to the rest of the world. How much do we trust a binding agreement that both parties will honor it? I don't know. I tend to be more pragmatic, so I generally think that's a good idea, and we should work towards that. Why wouldn't we? I mean, obviously, they want what's best for their people. We want what's best for our people, but I don't think we can. I don't think we can count on it.
Okay, a couple of questions on UBI. Why have UBI instead of legislative control of how AI is used in the jobs market? Isn't it cheaper to outlaw AI than subsidise an economy? And the next question is, if the GDP economy destroys the job market, it reduces the number of people who can earn money, then who pays the UBI? Who can afford the Etsy economy?
Okay, those are big questions. Let me deal with the first one. It's expected that AI and robots will increase the economy 100x over a certain horizon. So the thought is that these AI labs, and I think it'll be very few of them that ultimately end up making the biggest impact and become the most profitable, they'll be generating so much wealth that redistributing it will be kind of like a rounding error to ensure people have their basic needs. That's generally the thought. And for a while, I found that hard to believe, but the deeper I go into this industry, the more I'm convinced that it will be a few companies. The reason is, whatever company builds what is closest to AGI, the smartest artificial intelligence, it kind of has to be powering all security infrastructure, really any kind of fortune environment. It has to be, because effectively, you can't have a dumber AI protecting IT infrastructure, right? You need the smartest AI, otherwise you get hacked all the time. So there's this weird pull in the economy to prioritize the companies which build the state-of-the-art AI, and I think that they'll end up monopolizing. So anyway, these companies themselves, to their credit, are saying tax us. I mean, Demis Hassabis, Demis Hass from Google, DeepMind, Dario Modi from Anthropic, even Sam Altman from time to time is something like this. Elon, a little less clear, but they're all saying the same thing, that inevitably will have to be taxed, and we're okay with that. I don't know if their shareholders are, but they tend to be a little bit more principled and privileged, and so they can say that, and I think they mean it.
Okay. Do you have a sense, in terms of particular roles, of the work which forever remains human and de facto outside the domain of machines?
I think that's ultimately going to be a design decision for human beings. I generally think, just because I can get a pair of shoes for $2, which are state of the art, doesn't mean I'm going to pay the $2. Like, I may prefer the handmade shoes, right? There's something to that. There's a human being, right, who put time and energy, sweat and tears into that, and I generally think that will play out a fair bit. It'll be pretty pervasive throughout the economy. I do think with more time on our hands, and this survival paradigm no longer being around, I generally think that means that we'll be able to spend time and energy thinking about the things that matter more, and I think we'll eventually arrive that human beings are what ultimately matter, right? Hopefully God. And so the things which human beings produce just have higher value. And maybe that means we'll have more of a hunger for those products and the arts and everything else.
Kat Jenkins asks, how can the church ensure moral judgment is coded into material LLMs to learn? You cite Musk. He states empathy is weakness. How to counter this abusive power? In fairness, like, to defend Elon Musk, he has been fairly thoughtful. He's been one of the people from the very beginning who's been warning about artificial intelligence wrecking everything. He and Jeffrey Hinton said there's a 20% probability that this technology we're building ends civilization and leads to human extinction. He was one of the first people to say that. And he has said multiple times that his AI that he's trying to create, he's trying to ensure that it's kind of bound by truth, in the sense that it's bound by the laws of reality. Meaning someone shouldn't be able to distort, or the AI shouldn't be able to distort reality. That's a training objective. So effectively, truth is an objective function for his. So I think that's very commendable, because some labs are what is truth, right? It's whatever the government tells me it is, and that can be a little disturbing. So in many ways, I think what Musk is trying to do is commendable. Okay.
But I do think ultimately it's the labs that decide what their AIs are aligned to. They're the ones who set the objective function. They're the ones who develop the constitution which governs their AI. How much the governments should have influence over that, I don't know. I find that a little bit disturbing, but I also can see the need for it, and that's why I think it's very important that we all become very engaged in this conversation so our voices can be heard and we can influence this discussion.
Sure. Julia asks, is this another moment for God to awaken from the delusion of solving known problems while facing unknown issues, such as living within planetary boundaries?
I don't know, this is a tough one. I mean, I generally think that humanity's quest to explore has generally driven a lot of really important technological progress, which all in all has led to human beings doing better. I mean, if you look at the actual data, human beings are better than we ever have been before. So there's something to that, and I think technological progress has been a key part of it, obviously. So, people like Elon Musk who want to colonize the universe, right now, given the problems we have, that can seem like a weird misappropriation of resources for something that seems aspirational and almost kind of silly. But at the same time, many find it inspiring. And I think it'd be silly to ignore that quest will probably lead to a lot of really profound technological innovations that will probably end up solving a lot of problems on Earth. I mean, for instance, and he got laughed at for a while proposing data centers in space. But that actually is a big deal, and I think that they will do it. Google's now on board with this. That takes a lot of pressure off we humans here on Earth, right? Right. Water, energy, all that other stuff. So, and again, if Elon hadn't built SpaceX, we wouldn't be able to have that conversation, and he wouldn't have built SpaceX if he wasn't a big dreamer. So.
Yeah, there was a question actually saying AI isn't without cost, certainly in terms of energy. And thus the environment, are we sleepwalking towards a deeper climate crisis? So your answer would be?
No, I don't think so. Not in a meaningful horizon.
But processing in space is a lot cheaper.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly it's an answer to that problem. But generally, there was a time when data centers were run more inefficiently. But today's data centers, the ones Google's building, are extremely efficient. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying they still are very power hungry, but like the water usage is extremely well managed, provided the regulation in place is managing it. And, and I generally think that AI, and all the heads of the AI labs, including people like Mies Haspis, have said the benefits of using this technology to crack a lot of the barriers that we've had to unlocking new renewable energy, even things like fusion. It's thought within the industry that eventually we're going to use AI to crack that, and that would mean clean energy for all. So I think ultimately it's worth a short-term risk.
Okay. So we've got about five more minutes. We've got over 40 questions. Okay. So I think what we'll do is we'll ask you to maybe answer some of them offline, and then we can post them somewhere. So,
sure.
But there's still a few more I'd like to try and get through. Stephen asks, what would be the implications of preserving presence with the suffering vis-a-vis efforts to use robots to combat loneliness among the elderly, as in Japan?
Yeah, that's the robot thing. I get it. And some would argue, well, it's better than nothing, and I don't know. That would have to be studied. Maybe that's true. But Japan has been a canary in the coal mine for a long time. Like they're facing, as we know, a birth rate crisis. And I just recently became aware of this. It's quite disturbing to me that they have now a government sponsoring courting program. Because impotence and pornography addiction has basically crippled a lot of men. They lack the confidence to talk to women, and they can't. This performance anxiety is, and so now the state's having to step in. And now I would say in many ways, technological permeation in Japan is far more prevalent than some places. But I think there's a high probability that if we don't take an off ramp here, we're going to be heading the same direction.
Yeah, definitely. When we think about low complementary roles, how do we identify which jobs should be high complementary roles, and how should we design hybrid jobs? For example, the social care worker, so that we uphold the human conscience, ability to relate, think, create, act, so that we can still manage just as well if AI disappeared.
Yeah, I think this is going to be really a difficult one, because let's take medicine, for instance. I'd be very interested to if there was a study. Well, let's say that you had an AI which was better at diagnosing and, frankly, treating an illness than the human being. Mm-hmm. Okay. how many people would still show up to the doctor's office to talk to the human being versus just get the diagnosis at home and having it like dropped off, have the prescription dropped off via airlift or something like that? Mm-hmm. I'd be really interested to know how many people would actually choose to still go see the doctor. And this is one of the problems, right? In theory, I think we'd all acknowledge it's good that the doctor's there. Even though he may be assisted by an AI, we should still go see the doctor because he cares about us and things like this. Mm-hmm. How many people actually believe the doctor cares about them, right? And how many people will be willing to put in that work and effort? I worry about that a lot. And I think that's something that should be studied, and we should think about that very deeply. But I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. Okay.
This is the last question. Daniel asks, in an agentic economy, and I think you might just need to explain what that means, what types of goods do you expect agents to trade with each other, such as access to systems, analysis, or data?
So an agentic economy would basically be one in which AIs, which are acting agentically, are basically, they could be, buying and selling from each other. They could be working on products together. Doing one group of agents could be doing work for the other. I think it depends on the horizon. Again, it depends on a lot of the intentional decisions that we compel our governments to make. But I think ultimately, the GDP economy overwhelmingly will simply be agents. So effectively, people like Elon Musk who are trying to get to Mars, that requires enormous amounts of resources to do that. And so for them, they want to grow the economy. They want to produce goods and services and make them infinite. And downstream, that's great for all of humanity because we get all access to all these. But for them, it's really about driving their ultimate vision. And I think they're not going to care if it's agents that are driving that or if it's human beings. And I think that as long as private individuals are able to build companies that can set priorities like that, I think that's just something we'll just have to get used to.
Thank you, Matthew, so much.
Thank you.
You've really given us, I think correctly, a challenge that I think a lot of people really haven't woken up to. And I think for some people this might feel like a bad dream, but it is real. And we need people like you to help us navigate. And I feel like this is actually revealing the deeper purpose of what it means to be Christian in our time. The formation around anthropology, what does it mean to be human? This needs to be a part of our discipleship.
And I am optimistic. I think we are heading towards a golden era. I think the transition's going to be rough.
Transition's going to be very rough.
But I think it's ultimately.
Yeah, but I mean, this is going to demand a lot of our politicians. So I think all of us here, it's incumbent on all of us to bring forward these kinds of discussions as quickly as possible. So just to let everybody know, the recording of this evening will be on our Substack as a podcast in about a week's time. Matthew's text, I think, we'll probably put up tomorrow. So do follow us on t4cg.substack.com. We've got another event coming up in October. You'll find out more about that there. The work of Together for the Common Good is done by a tiny core team of 1.9 full-time equivalent people, all our work. So we need your support. So if you're able to, please help us. Just to say again, thank you to our sponsors, the Guild of Our Lady of Ransom, CCLA and the Catholic Union, and to all our guests here in person, and especially to you, Matthew. Thank you so much.
Thank you.